Hello, this is the Net Hero podcast. I'm Sumit Bose, and this podcast is all about business and doing better for the planet. It's not an eco podcast, we're not green warriors. We believe that business is good and business will make the difference, but it's about holding businesses to account. So if you're interested in what we're doing to try and make things better, to stop our polluting of the planet, to stop our global warming, to stop us driving around in cars that are polluting the air that we breathe, this is the podcast for you. It's all about business, it's about invention, it's about entrepreneurs, scientists, and frankly, there's a few wild cards as well. Do hope you enjoy listening to this episode, and make sure you subscribe and follow us on your social media platforms, and please check out our two news websites, energylivenews.com and Future Net Zero. On with the show. How green are you and me? In fact, how green is this pen? How green is this bottle? How green it is your washing up liquid, or this aftershave you put on today? Or how green is the pesticides that you're using, if you are using them? When we talk about green, we always talk about kind of, the big stuff. We talk about big renewables, we talk about big nuclear, we talk about EVs, we talk about kind of things that people are going to relate to, the plastics and kind of, changing that. But the one thing we don't, and I certainly haven't really thought about, is the chemicals that go into everything, from the materials that your computers are made of, to the clothes you wear, to the food you eat, the packaging. And a major area is sort of chemicals for industry, for food, sex, for the NHS, for paints. One of the big things that we have, and many of you have heard the phrase embedded carbon, is that some of the things we make have got a carbon kind of cost to it. And one of the biggest areas of that are these chemicals. So what can we do about them? Well, today, the guest on the podcast is a man who's running a company that's trying to take this sort of the carbon out of these chemicals, creating these biochemicals. And I'm delighted to say I'm joined by the CEO of Celtic Renewables, Mark Simmers. Hello, Mark.
Hello, Summit. Yeah, delighted to be here and really looking forward to contributing to the conversation.
Thank you so much. Now, I've made a hand fist of it, but basically the chemicals we use, we don't even think about it, right? So from the dyes, the toothpaste, doesn't matter what it is, they're everywhere. So just before we talk about what you're doing with these kind of biochemicals, have they been just part of how industrialization has happened? So you think you're getting something like, oh, a nice pair of jeans, but you don't even think about what's gone into dyeing them, do you?
No, I mean, there's so many processes that use chemicals, and there are thousands and thousands of everyday products and services that we use that are wholly reliant on those chemicals. And with the discovery of oil, what was that, century ago?
Yeah.
Mankind's been incredibly innovative and clever in terms of the way that we've developed materials over the last 100 years. But the vast majority of those are dependent on chemicals that come from fossil fuels, and that's that underpins everybody's everyday life. As you've just pointed out in your introduction, in the room I'm sitting in here in our plant in Grangemouth, there's probably 50 or 60 things around me that were made with or have those chemicals in them. And I think just to that point, I mean, we don't talk about decarbonising chemicals because that's, the carbon's in everything. Carbon is in our body. I mean, we're all, everything's made of carbon.
Yeah.
But the question is, where does that carbon come from? And so our approach is about using secondary sources of carbon that are already above the ground, and not dug up from under the ground. And so we tend to use the phrase defossilization rather than decarbonisation, because that's actually what we're talking about here from a chemicals perspective.
I suppose people may, you don't really think about it, right? Because we shorten it. We call it the oil and gas industry or whatever we do. But actually, there is a technical term, petrochemical industry, right? Which kind of says it is. So just going back again a little bit in the history of this, it seems to me, having just done a little bit of research into this, that the moment the oil industry sort of came to fruition, and people forget this, that actually it spun off all these things. The plastics industry came out of it, and then all these chemical industries, because originally all this stuff comes from fossil fuels.
Yeah.
Is that how it's gone? And then we've made synthetic versions of them, but originally they were all derived, or is it a mix?
Well, I mean, so the process we use was invented 100 years ago, and we predominantly make two chemicals, acetone and butanol. And the process we use is called ABE fermentation, and that was invented before the petrochemical industry was around.
Wow.
So the original pathway or the original way of producing acetone and butanol at scale was through a biological pathway converting crops into these chemicals. Now, that process died out because of the advent of the petrochemical industry, particularly when the Saudi Arabian oil fields really sort of came on stream post Second World War. So history shows us that we can make these chemicals using a biological pathway, but actually we moved away from that because it was easier to do it from in the petrochemical way. And what we're trying to do is bring back that original process, but rather than using, sort of food competing crops,
Yeah.
we're using, secondary sources of carbohydrate, i.e. waste and residues. And so we've taken that old process that everybody knew how to do, but we've repurposed it in a more sustainable way.
What would what did you say? They were butanol. What was the other one? Acetone, was it?
Acetone. Yeah. So when you think about
What
acetone, you
what are they
think
used
about.
for?
Yeah, so butanol is used in paints, coatings. It's used in intermediaries to make cosmetics. Acetone, you think of nail varnish
Yes,
remover,
of
nail
course. That's the only thing I
polish.
think of. Yeah.
Yeah, but they're used, for instance, in the synthesis of medicines. They're used
Ah,
in the production of plastics. Butanol is used in your screen wash for your car. So, some really kind of obvious, oh gosh, I didn't realize, sort of everyday items that these go into.
we've sort of had a funny history with chemicals, haven't we? Really, because ICI, right, was a big brand name. Then it's probably become Unilever. I don't know what they've become now. Anyway, whatever. But there was these big industries built up pre Second World War and certainly post war, and chemical sort of processing um, has been a very big part of our modern life. And whatever people say, and I know there is a toxicity to these chemicals, they've transformed our lives, right? They've made our lives a lot better, made us a lot healthier with the medicines. When did you start to think about the kind of fossil fuel impact of these chemicals? Before you started uh, the company, was it something you thought of? Because you told me your background was sort of economist rather than kind of a sort of an eco background. So when did you first start to think about actually these things have got a kind of fossil fuel impact?
I think it was really when I first got involved with the research opportunity that became Celtic Renewables. So this was about 14 years ago. Um, and I'm based here in Scotland. I've always had a huge sort of focus on the environment.
Yeah.
I live in a very beautiful part of the world. But I think the realization that you know sort of renewables, sort of um, carbon reduction opportunities, and from a business perspective, they both have to make sense from an environmental perspective, but they've also got to make sense from a business perspective.
Of
So,
course. Yeah.
I suppose as a environmentally conscious economist, it's got to work on both fronts, and so that's. I did an entrepreneurial MBA, and joining this opportunity came as a result of that. And I think seeing something that really made sense from a business perspective, but also made huge sense from an environmental perspective, really captured my imagination. And that's sort of what got me interested in the first place, and what has really sort of driven me forward in terms of scaling this opportunity up.
Is it a spin-off originally? It's coming from like some scientists, or how did it?
Yeah, so this was a research project at Edinburgh Napier University.
Oh,
So
right.
one of the three universities in Edinburgh. Um, And Professor Martin Tangney and his research team, he's the scientific founder behind Celtic Renewables, really his sort of idea originally. And we've taken that research and taken it from small test tubes in the lab up to full manufacturing scale. Yeah, the scale of fermentation increases 2 million times. So we've gone from 50 mils in the labs up to 100,000 liters.
Wow.
In the big, you can see the sort of bigger fermentation tanks in the picture behind me
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
is the scale that we're now operating at.
So let's talk us through the process. So you said that you originally we made these chemicals from plant material, and then obviously when we got the big boom of oil and gas, people went, "Oh, it's a lot easier just to get this stuff from the hydrocarbons." So how did you go back to it, and what are you using as your base material to start to make these biochemicals?
Yeah, so Martin and his team looked at, what were the sort of largest volumes of biological leftovers, byproducts, waste, and being based in Scotland, funnily enough, that comes from the whisky industry.
Of course.
So we use a liquid called pot ale, which is a sort of relatively nutrient-rich sort of byproduct from the distillation process of making whiskey. So we use that as our sort of base liquid, and then we add in secondary sources of carbohydrate. So at our first plant here, the two primary sources are reject potatoes. So we have a commercial agreement with a wholesale company that basically provides 100% of the potatoes to Tesco.
Yeah,
So we take their grade C's, grade A's go to your table, grade B's go into crisps and chips and things, and we take the grade C's. And so we get deliveries of those pretty much every day. And then we also supplement that with some low-grade molasses, so the byproducts of the sugar industry. So, non-food competing sort of types of molasses that we use as well.
so this is very important because you look at the alternatives for a lot of things, and there's that big tension between feeding us and saving the planet, right? And
Yeah.
this is where people have issues with, certain crops, bio crops, and the palm oil. We know all of this sort of stuff. So, are you saying that what the company's looked at, you're able to use things that won't compete with the fragile food chain that we all rely on?
Yeah, 100%. So, I mean, that's deeply ingrained in our philosophy and our approach to what we do. We won't use, material that's food competing because we just think that's not right. And I think, and that's really resonating, particularly with our downstream customers. They can see the provenance of the chemicals that we're making, and they can see our commitment to that very sustainable circular supply chain that we've adopted, and making sure that that's where we go. And we've got a whole range of other feedstocks that we've already trialed and are moving forward. So things like paper and cardboard from packaging, some leftovers from the dairy industry, other drinks industries, and we're even looking at sewage sludge. So, so not very charming material to talk about, but ultimately, if we can create chemicals from what is clearly a waste issue,
Yeah, yeah.
then that's the way forward, we believe.
So let's break down the ecological side of this. So the good thing is you've got stuff that's already out, right? Like you said, above ground. So you're not having to go to oil and gas and digging it up. Then you're going to treat this stuff and you're going to make these chemicals. So these questions are pretty obvious that I'm sure I'm going to ask, but there must be a carbon cost for you to do this, like making these things, whether you heat them or whatever. How do you make your process as efficient as possible so that you're not, even though you're using a good kind of low carbon base, you don't add lots of energy that's from dare I say
Yeah.
burning stuff. Do you see what I mean?
No, I mean that's one of the main challenges of these processes. So at the moment we save about 60% carbon compared to petrochemical equivalents. So that's a good start. But what we've developed, it's all about developing the back end of your process. So
Yeah.
actually, the effluent that's left over at the end of our process is a really good input for the production of biogas. And then, so what we're about is not looking at our own process in isolation, but really creating, a longer value chain, both from an environmental and from a commercial perspective. So we would bring in, we'll bring in these, byproducts and wastes. We put them through our process. We'll then put our leftover through biogas to make gas. We also make hydrogen and food grade CO2 during our fermentation. And then we're going to bolt on water treatment at the back end. So ostensibly, you'll go from secondary byproducts and wastes, create high value chemicals. You'll then create biogas, and then effectively you'll create no waste at the back end. So it's about using up everything of value that's in that material, and ending up with no waste. So that should get us from 60% where we are now to potentially 100% or even better,
Wow.
where our process becomes a carbon sump or a carbon capture process, as well as being the source of very valuable green chemicals.
The chemicals you make, how would they do, as they say, the old Pepsi test? How would they compare to a chemical that's made through the conventional sort of fossil fuel route? Is there any difference structurally or not?
No, I mean, it's the same molecule. It just comes through a different biological pathway.
That can be used in industry just straight away, no
Yeah.
problem.
And there's very high purity requirements, and we're talking 99.5 to 99.8% purity. The impurities that we have are maybe slightly different because we're coming from a different starter material, but all the testing that we're doing with the customer side is that there's no issue with that. And ultimately, the advantages from being 100% biogenic carbon rather than fossil-based carbon is what those customers are seeking.
So where are they going right now? You don't have to name firms, but sort of what sort of industries are buying these biochemicals that you're making?
Yeah, so two or three of the big players in the pharmaceutical industry have tested and are buying our chemicals. Two or three businesses based in cosmetics to create, there's an intermediary product going into skin creams, for instance. We've had a purchase from a company trying to produce a more all natural based screen, washing fluid. In discussions with probably the major lab chemical supply business in the world,
Wow.
because these chemicals are used as reagents or cleaning agents in the
Yeah.
lab. And so being able to use, reagents that are, effectively, 100% biogenic carbon and very sustainable is what businesses want to get to. So those are some of the sort of primary use cases at the moment. We're only making a very small, well,
Yeah.
we're making hundreds of tons in our first plant.
Yeah. Yeah.
The global market for these chemicals is 13 million tons and growing per annum.
Wow.
So, we're at a very, very small scale in terms of overall global demand. But, seeking to scale up sort of quickly now that we've proven the process works, so that we can start to meet that growing demand.
Some of our listeners and viewers will have heard of Grangemouth. If you haven't, it's a massive refinery that's up in Scotland, has been there for, I think it was about 80 years. I can't remember how long it is. You probably know better than me, but
Yeah, yeah.
you're based on part of that site, which unfortunately has been now sort of mothballed, closed down. So they're looking at the way that this site could be repurposed. One of them
Yeah.
is hydrogen, and I think you guys might be part of it. So do you see that something like what you're doing with Celtic could sort of give these refiners, because there's jobs there, there's infrastructure, and also there's a huge, I mean, you built the bloody thing. It's been built for like, 50, 60 years. There's all of that infrastructure. It'd be absolute heinous to tear that down and think about the carbon cost of that. So do you believe things like what you're doing could give these sort of refineries, we don't have many left, a new life in a greener way?
Absolutely. We're really excited about the opportunity here at Grangemouth. We're part of the project. It's called Project Willow. and that's about creating a low carbon manufacturing complex on the, original petrochem refinery site and actually wider across the overall Grangemouth complex. There was a report published in the middle of March by UK and Scottish governments outlining those plans. And they highlighted initial 9 technologies. We're one of those. And so we're aiming to basically take what we've built as a first plant and scale that up by a factor of 10 or 15 times. And, so exactly repurposing land, repurposing infrastructure and utilities, and particularly offering employment to, a large
Yeah,
number of people
yeah,
that have lost their jobs as a result of the closure of the refinery. Um, Even in our first plant, about nearly 30% of our staff have come from petrochemical backgrounds. So the Scottish government talk about a just transition, about
yeah, yes,
particularly
absolutely. Yeah.
around people, and so we're very much a kind of real example of how that's already happening, and how that becomes a really exciting opportunity. And I think Scotland, UK, could be a real shining light in terms of how you create that transition from petrochemical assets to low carbon manufacturing assets, in areas such as chemicals and hydrogen, as you say, sustainable aviation fuel.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Those are some of the plastics recycling. Those are some of the key technologies that have been highlighted to be part of the Project Willow opportunity.
If you look at what you're doing, I suppose, and most of our audience would have heard of scope one, two, three. Scope three is always the most difficult, right? Which is, you got rid of kind of what you're doing directly, you're trying to cut down what you're using, but then all the things you buy and all the things, your ingredients, whatever they are, your supply chain has that carbon. Now, I know that you've looked at kind of how you might help, for example, the NHS with, the supply chain kind of carbon footprint of the basic chemicals that go into the drugs. So do you see this kind of industry, and I know you're not the only player, but this industry of these kind of biochemicals helping bigger firms or helping institutions with their scope three?
No, absolutely. I mean, that's our core focus, and we look at ourselves as being, we all live our lives in a certain way. We're so reliant on, the things that we use, and therefore the chemicals that go into it to use those.
Yeah,
And so we look at ourselves as, and one of, a number of businesses in the UK and now, developing sector is really a positive enabler for people generally to continue to live their lives in the same way, but knowing that the ingredients are what's gone in to make the things that they rely on, more sustainable. And so it's not saying to people, oh, don't do this anymore, you have to change the way you live. No, you can carry on living the way you currently do. And so it's really important that businesses like ours thrive and scale, because that is that sort of
yeah.
positive enabler.
Is it a very UK kind of thing, or is this being done in other parts of the world? Are you looking at other parts of the world? Where is this industry right now?
Yeah, so in terms of what we do in terms of the AB fermentation process, we're the pioneer and the world leader in terms of what we do.
Brilliant.
And yes, others are looking at this, and it's a huge opportunity. Um, as I said before, we're looking at a whole range of other input feedstocks which are globally available. So looking at other drinks industries around the world, as I talked about, paper and cardboard
Yeah,
and
yeah.
sewage and dairy. And so, these are co-products and leftovers that are available globally. So, this is a fully international opportunity. I think in terms of biochemicals, as you said in the introduction, it's things that people haven't really thought about
No, absolutely.
probably and properly over the last sort of 5 to 10 years, and so there are
But this is a fledgling industry then, sort of, really.
yeah, yeah. So it is a fledgling industry, but it's one with huge scale of opportunity, and so people are really starting to look at how they harness that.
What are you going to do about one of the other things before we end is water. Water's a big resource that has to be used in all of these things. Water, I know, is used massively in the whiskey industry. So, although you got a lot of rain, even more than we have down here, you need to be conscious of your water So what about your processes in terms of the ancillary, your own kind of scope 3? What you're using, where you're getting your water sources, how you're making sure that you're trying to use as little as possible. Are you looking into that?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think I just sort of described that before, but we very, about 97% of what comes out the back end of our process is water. And so, what we need to do is to try and recycle that,
Yeah.
as much as possible. So, we've got a cleaning liquid requirement for our own biological process. We've got to clean tanks and pipes and all sorts of
Yeah.
things. So as we move forward, it's very much the case that we'll look to continue to recycle that, water as much as possible. We're looking at an opportunity with the rum industry, for instance, in the Caribbean.
I do like the businesses you look at there.
Yeah, because I'll,
Whiskey and rum.
yeah, because ultimately, a lot of these Caribbean islands where they make rum, they're having to basically dispose of the liquid
Yes.
effluent into the sea because
Yeah,
there's nowhere else for it to go.
yeah.
And actually, ironically, although they get a lot of, sort of rain at different times of the year, they are water shortages there. So, you know, we see ourselves then being as a way of harnessing that water, creating chemicals, but then bringing, a circular economy approach to, those territories where you then start to solve that, potential water shortage by, effectively providing that to other. So you could then co-locate with the rum industry or the
Yeah.
rum producer and then effectively recycle the water back into their process. So, it's got endless opportunities. We've just got to be careful not to try and grab too many at once. But
No. If
um,
you're doing good things, then go for the market share. What's your sort of hope? Because obviously, the Grangemouth facility is still kind of up in the air. We hope Willow will mean that it gets a new life. Uh, where are you? Because you said to me you're at revenue, which is great, and you've got some customers now. What's your short-term hope in the next kind of 3 to 5 years for where this biochemicals industry goes?
yeah, so we expect to have built and brought into operation a much bigger plant within the next 3 years, and that'll get us to profitability, and that's obviously a key thing for a business. But we're already working on probably up to 12 opportunities beyond that, both here in Scotland, across the UK, but internationally. And our hope is that this process and what we are doing really takes off in terms of demand. We're not going to build all those projects. We're
No, of course,
you know
yeah.
we're more the technology provider than the infrastructure creator. But there's an enormous market opportunity. Oil will run out, and
Yeah,
so
of course.
ultimately, this needs to grow to be able to do what I said, enable people to live their lives in the same way. So, I hope that we'll see, what we're doing and what other, biochemical producers are doing just start to become, a real growing and then mainstream sector, that ultimately the world needs.
Mark, I couldn't agree with you. I think you're doing a brilliant job. It's great British story of invention, great Scottish story of invention, and also it involves two things I love: whiskey and rum. So I mean, you can't go wrong, mate.
No, it's a win-win
It's a
round.
win-win, and chips as well. So yeah.
Yeah.
Describe my diet. It was not very good. Mark, I wish you all the best with what you're doing at Celtic, and really hope that this is a way that we can still continue, as you said, living our lives, but at a much lower carbon sort of intensity. Thank you very much for your time today.
No, delighted to be part of it. Thank you.
What do you think, ladies and gents? Let us know, especially if you live up that part of the way, because I think it's a great thing to give Grangemouth another lease of life. And these new biochemicals could be the way. My thanks to Rob for the production this week. Remember, if you want to be on the podcast, then just email us, nethero@futurenetzero.com. See you next time, man.
You've just heard the Net Hero podcast from futurenetzero.com. Join us as we help you find ways to cut your carbon footprint as we head towards net zero. Subscribe and follow us on social media. futurenetzero.com. Better business, better planet.